My beef with the leadership development industry is that we haven't provided anything. Often that adaptation requires holding back on who you really are. People who end up defining the norms or the culture in a team are the leaders.
The definition of leadership that I like to use here at Ideas for Leaders are people who create the conditions for others to do their best work.
Because when you're in a team, you're not just creating the conditions between you and each individual. You're creating a relationship among the others. And that's what leaders don't get taught. So what you need to care about is
Vanessa Druskat is an associate professor of organizational behavior and a global expert in leadership and team performance, and has helped Fortune 500 companies build high-performing teams. Her work has been featured in Harvard Business Review.
So what happens is you're born, there are your parents, and you learn how to behave in a way that gets your needs met. People who study the brain say, hey, one of the great things about human beings, their superpower. They can create a social situation best meets their needs.
What are the key elements of it, the key norms, perhaps, that we should be seeking?
The way we built the model was by going into organizations and looking at teams that were doing the same tasks, but some of them were just really doing well. They were outstanding, doing outstanding. Getting to know who they are and respecting them for who they are.
Hello, Vanessa. Welcome to The Power Between.
Thank you, Roddy. I appreciate your inviting me here.
It's great to have you. I'm thrilled, in fact, that you're with us today because you've been a thought leader in team emotional intelligence for many years, both in your capacity as a professor of organizational behavior at Paul College at the University of New Hampshire, and also as an internationally recognized researcher and speaker on team EI and advisor, I think, also to lots of large companies, which would be interesting to get a bit of an insight into. And of course, this summer, you've just published your book, The Emotionally Intelligent Team, published by Harvard Business Review Press. And that's really what we're going to focus in on today. But perhaps before we do that, I'm really keen to find out what drew you into this, looking at this area of organizational behavior. And of course, we here on The Power Between are really interested in what happens in the middle of organizations, which is that layer that is perhaps less well explored than that senior leaders
Sure.
certainly are.
Yeah, very important layer. I'm glad you're focusing in on that. Yeah, so I had some good team experiences when I was young. I was an athlete. I played what you in Scotland would call football, but we call it soccer in the US. And I was also a cheerleader, which is something I don't confess to many people. I don't think I wrote about that in the book. But anyway, I was an athlete when I was young, and I also grew up in a farming community, and I worked on a lot of farms starting at the age of 12. And so I worked in a lot of teams that were just fabulous. And, we all supported one another, and I always felt really like a strong contributing member to them. But when I got to the workplace, it was just a very different story. There was a lot of competition among people. I always felt like people were pushing me aside to put themselves forward rather than supporting me in any way. And so anyway, I went back to graduate school and I started thinking about what was my perspective on teams and, how was it different than what other researchers were doing. So let me just say, I've got 3 degrees in psychology, and in all 3 degrees, I was interested in teams. So I was always interested in teams. That was my thing. And whenever I read any articles on it, they were always about personalities in teams. What certain personalities or skills would label you to or allow you to be a contributing member. This is what made teams tick, or personalities and connecting. It just did not fit my experience because I knew I had the same personality that I had when I was, really a well contributing member to when I was pushed aside by others. It certainly wasn't personality that determined that. So I started thinking about my own experience, and I write about this a little bit in the book, but I grew up in a family with international educators. So my parents met overseas teaching, and my father's field was international education. And so we traveled a lot when I was a child. And one of the things that I learned as a child was that every time I went to another culture, there were different norms, different social norms required for me to fit in and play with the kids, you know. For example, one of the things I've talked a little bit about is I started school in Kenya. My dad was working, he was helping to Africanize the education system when Kenya got its independence from Great Britain.
UK.
Yeah. And and so we were living there and I started school and it was fascinating because it was actually a British school system. And so I would have to behave one way in that British school system, which I wasn't very good at fitting in to. I'd have to behave another way with my African friends because we lived amongst these Africans. And I'd have to behave another way when I was with my family, you know? And so I would basically code switch from, "Well, this is what you do here, this is what you do here," you know, it's very formal in the British school system. You know, I like to talk about a story about when I was winning races and the headmaster came over and said, "No, we don't do that. We don't jump up and down for joy when we win races here."
Still stiff upper lip with us. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So anyway, because of that, and because I traveled my whole life into different cultures, even one of the biggest cultural differences I had when we moved to Texas from where I'd been living in Massachusetts and I was in middle school. I can't tell you how different the norms were in Texas. But anyway, so I basically came to teams thinking that there was an environment that was created, that the social norms changed from one team to the next. And I didn't see that anywhere in the literature. So I started studying that. And I literally would go in, first study I did was in a manufacturing organization where I would go from team to team doing the exact same task and behaving very differently. You know, there were some teams where the only thing they really cared about was taking a longer break. So they would use their brains to calculate how to, and then there were some teams that were just really, you know, involved in producing the best product and blah. And so anyway, I got very interested in norms and that became what I studied. And I also learned early on, I'm going to stop in a minute and ask you for your follow-up, but let me just say I learned early on.
No, I'm hanging on every word.
Oh, good. Okay, okay, good, thanks. I started saying, okay, well, the academic researchers are not telling the story that I'm familiar with. So I went out and started engaging in, you know, group facilitation courses and things out that organizations were running. And one of the things that I learned early on, before we'd ever even heard of emotional intelligence, was that if you followed the emotion in the room, you could tell what the issues were. So little known fact that good facilitators are reading the emotion in the room. Where's the tension? Where's the emotion? Emotion's contagious. And so it tends to, you can to catch it yourself even. And so that was a powerful move for me. I started examining that in my research. And by the time the book Daniel Goleman produced, you know, wrote his Emotional Intelligence, a big bestseller, and a couple of researchers produced that, I was ready and able to leap in with saying, "Hey, there is also an emotionally intelligent environment that we need to talk about," and that's what my research has been about.
Fantastic. I mean, there's lots there to unpack. So
Yes,
that's
yes.
brilliant. I mean, we've seen over the years and Developing Leaders Quarterly that I publish, we've had great articles about. There was a fabulous article by an Aboriginal lady in Australia who was unpicking this idea of collective cultures against individualistic cultures. I suspect that what you were seeing or experiencing when you were certainly in Kenya, which is much more collectivist, particularly compared to Britain and the US, which are probably towards the extreme end of the individualistic spectrum. And so moving between those cultures requires an agility, does it not, for you? And so I'm interested that you said that when you were going, you had to behave differently or take on a sort of different approach when you were with your African friends in the British school and then again when you were in Texas. Is that an unreasonable thing to expect people to do, or are we always going to have to adapt the ways we respond to be successful?
First of all, we tend to adapt. We try to adapt. We're kind of wired to be able to adapt, but we don't learn that skill. We're not cognizant of it. And so we don't do it fast enough. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to remain ourselves and adapt at the same time. Often that adaptation requires holding back on who you really are. Right. And then, the people who end up defining the norms or the culture in a team are the leaders. And it can be the informal leaders or it can be the formal leaders. So one of the things that I found is if you've got a weak leader, you can have informal leaders in the team kind of taking over what the culture is. But it tends to be just a few people who get to define that. And one of my arguments is that that's not always the best. I like people to say, okay, what kind of culture do we want to develop? And let's take a look at what the possibilities are. But let me come back to your question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it, but I can tell you that I don't know when I share my ideas about norms with people in the UK or with people in Europe or people around the world, they seem to get it more than people in the US do. We have more than in the UK, a very individualistic culture. And everyone just thinks, I mean, I've had even reviewers of my papers who are academics say, what do you mean about these norms? We have individual control. We have freedom. We can do whatever we want. And what are you talking about? Norms control our behavior. And in the US, we're very, very individualistic. A lot of people think it's in part because of, hey, who emigrated to the US anyway? People who were fine with leaving their families behind.
There's an element to that, isn't there? The
Yeah.
genetic flow of immigrants are the people who have had enough where they are and they want to want to be themselves more somewhere else. Is that
Yes,
not?
or yeah, and that's not entirely it, right? So we can't say that's everyone. But in general, you get and then of course our system, our capitalistic system has just really rewarded people who focus on themselves. So anyway, I find for my ideas, it's always been easier, for example, in sort of more European or British journals for people to say, "Oh yeah, social norms, we get that," because we move between cultures more frequently than we do in the U.S. or more consciously.
But no, that's the critical part that I think it's that consciously part. It's the
Conscious,
intentionality about
yes,
it. And in order to do that, in order to have the intention to behave differently, as opposed to just behaving differently because it emerges, you need to understand what the norms are. And I suspect it may be worthwhile just trying to unpick a little bit about what you mean by norms in any sentence, because I mean
yeah.
that we don't tend to go into a new organization or a new grouping, whatever it may be. And sort of our first plan is that to go, oh, what are the norms around here for me to take stock of?
Yeah, we
Or perhaps we
don't.
should.
We actually do. Let me tell you. What differentiates human beings from other animals, other social animals even, is that we are born as social learners. We're not born with instincts that tell us how to behave. And the ability that we have as social learners, the reason we evolved that way is because it allows us to adapt. So what happens is you're born and you look, there are your parents, and you learn how to behave in a way that gets your needs met, right? And how do I cry in order to convey that I want food? And they react. When we become teenagers, we switch our attention from the family to the social group, and this is where we build our skills learning how to fit in. But we have, at any time we enter a new group, we scan the situation to find out how do things work in this environment. And we typically scan and look at who looks like they know what they're doing around here. And we look at the leaders. And social anthropologists think that we immediately want to know, who do we have to follow if there's danger here. That's probably why we tend to look to leaders. So we do that, but we don't do it consciously enough. We don't recognize that we have control over these norms. And this is where my work comes in. And it's not just me, there's plenty of other people who think this way, but, I've delved into it a little more deeply than most. So, for example, people who study the brain say, "Hey, one of the great things about human beings, their superpower is that they can create the social situation that best meets their needs." Right? And so Lisa Feldman Barrett, for example, who's a social neuroscientist at Northeastern University in Boston, she talks about this as the human superpower. Build the environment you want. It's going to allow you to create the norms that you want. So we don't realize we have that power. Leaders don't realize that that is their role. They need to figure out is I have delved into what are the social norms in the very best teams? What is it that they do so that we can have a best practice look at, what are the kinds of norms you want to consciously create? Because there's always norms. It's just usually they just come up from, the way the group interacts, the way we follow our leaders.
It's great to hear you say that. I mean, the definition of leadership that I like to use here at Ideas for Leaders are people who create the conditions for others to do their best work.
Yes,
And that seems to be pretty much what you're saying is
that is
that
exactly what I'm saying. So let me add something to that, because when you're in a team, you're not just creating the conditions between you and each individual. You're creating a relationship among the others. And that's what leaders don't get taught. So what you need to care about is how they interact with one another. And those are the conditions you need to create for a team to thrive.
I've written down here, sort of brought out from the core idea in your book, which is building a high performing team begins with understanding that teams are systems, and team performance depends on the quality of the interactions among team members, not the characteristics and strengths of the individuals. Now, that's a fair sort of top line summary of what you're saying, I think. How many organizations, you've presumably looked at lots of organizations, how many organizations get that, again, in this conscious fashion, are aware of this, and this is something they proactively have to manage? I imagine quite a few of them do it anyway because they just get it right, and there'll be quite a lot of people getting wrong about how many people are actually aware of this when they're doing it.
People who will dig in and try to figure it out on their own, or they're analyze what happened in the best teams that I participated in. What do I need to create here? They at least recognize that there's an esprit de corps that needs to be built in the team, and it's not just going to pop up because of the interpersonal skills of the individuals. That's just not how it works. You've got to create something that's the team. My beef with the leadership development industry is that we haven't provided anything that for team leaders to figure this out. They have to read between the lines and figure things out. And so some leaders do it, some leaders don't. But personally, I don't see a lot. I see a lot of teams that are just fine. And I'll get a call from a team when the leader recognizes that they're not meeting their potential. Why is it I hired, classic examples, I hired all these geniuses. We went to a lot of trouble hiring these great people and it's just not paying off. Why are they arguing rather than why aren't they aligned in their vision? Why are they, competing for my attention, for example? That's an aware leader who sees that. And that's when I've been able to come in and say, okay, let's take your current norms. What are the norms? And here's a model of best practice. Which of these do you think would work better in your team? And then you consciously develop the norms that you think will work well for your team. And it improves how people interact and what gets done. And again, some leaders just get that right from the get-go. And those are leaders who are a pleasure to work with because they are the ones that have helped me build my model.
Well, let's explore the model a little bit then. I mean, what are the sort of the key elements of it, the key norms, perhaps, that we should be seeking or trying to create?
Sure, sure. So let me just say that the way we built the model was by going into organizations and looking at teams that were doing the same tasks, but some of them were just really doing well. They were outstanding, doing outstanding. And we compared those to the average performers. And so we really, statistically looked at what makes the outstanding teams unique. And we did that in many different organizations. And so we built kind of a generic model of what great teams do. And so that's what I'll explain to you now. But what we do when we go into teams is we say, here's the generic model, take it away, you put your stamp on it. So the norms fall into 3 different categories. There's 9 of them altogether. The first category we label how we help one another succeed. I actually have changed the labels over the years, but that's the one I've stuck on now. How we help one another succeed. This is about caring for the individuals in the team and giving them feedback, getting to know who they are, and respecting them for who they are. And this is the norm that's going to help you from getting groupthink. If your audience knows what groupthink is, it's basically when people just conform because they want to fit in. What you want is you want to take care of your individuals, because if you don't, they're going to check out. They're going to, just do what needs to be done, or they're just not going to be putting their best foot forward. By the way, we've known that for, I don't know, 75 years. If you don't care for the individuals, weird things happen. Okay. Because they are
But it's
what
still a challenge. I mean, it's still seen as being, as sort of a soft approach to management or leadership, isn't it? I mean, I spend my entire time arguing the other case, but there's still a large part of the world who thinks the idea of overtly caring for your team rather than instructing and directing is wasted energy.
I know. I can't figure that out. I'll tell you don't see that in the best teams. You do not
And
see
I think
that.
that's so important to
That's the bit
highlight,
that's so
isn't it?
important. I mean, I'm telling you, I've studied a lot of great teams in a lot of different industries, and you don't see it in the best. You know? So, I remember one of the names of the companies, I always have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, kind of thing when I do research, but one of the companies I worked in that said, "Yeah, go ahead and use our name as Johnson& and Johnson Pharmaceuticals." We looked at their drug development teams, and they wanted to know, why is it some just sail through the process and we do really well, and some just don't? I remember, and so we study them, and then we find out which ones are the greats and the average. We don't know when we're interviewing and surveying which are which. But this one leader basically said, "Look, I've been doing this for a long time, and I no longer wait to get perfect team members. Nobody on my team is an A+ individual. But when we work together, we do A+ work." And that is because of the environment, the conditions, if you will, that he creates and the norms he creates. And they just were rocking it. I mean, they were doing great.
I'm interested in this because is that something to do with a failed recruitment process that we're always trying to get the best person at a particular function rather than looking at how that person may fit
Fit in.
into and enable a team to be better?
I just think that hiring is an imperfect process. We go to great lengths to hire people way high in the organization, and even that's imperfect, you know? But people game the system. I've been called into medical schools before to help them figure out how they can get people who aren't faking it in the interviews. They said they were gonna work in the country, and then then all they wanna do is work in, Toronto. They don't wanna go, because Canada can pay for their education. They wanna how do we get it right? Okay, anyway, coming back to that. It's an imperfect process. I learned this from my mentor and from his research on norms and things. You hire for the skills you need. You don't wanna get someone with no interpersonal skills. But if you're choosing between the great skills and someone with mediocre skills and interpersonal skills, go for the great skills. You hire for the skills. Then you build the environment that makes them great. So, in his research, similar to mine, finds that you get all those geniuses in the room. This has been shown over and over again. Unfortunately, it's not communicated to people like you and your audience. I got to tell you, one of my goals in writing this book was take this information and get it out to you. But
Sure.
let me tell you why it doesn't happen. I don't get rewarded for this. In my academic publisher parish, writing a book like this gets me nothing.
Nothing.
Okay? People said, "You're gonna kill your career. Why are you writing that?" Because someone's gonna tell people what we know. I mean, that's always been my value. I'm just more, a teacher. I'm more of a teacher like my parents than but you may have noticed I'm still an associate professor, not a full professor. And that's because I've been writing these articles for the public. But my articles for the public are, I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review that's been published 6 times on my TMEI model, republished 6 times in their bestsellers. I wrote an article for, MIT Sloan that was republished 3 times in their bestsellers because I'm just taking what we know and sharing it with the public. And what I need you to know right now is that you don't have to hire the perfect people. You have to create a good environment that brings out the best in them because every one of us has a gamut in the way we behave. We can listen or we will not listen. We can integrate our ideas with others or we don't. And so coming back to the norms in the model, let me come back to that. First thing is you have got to care for your individuals or they're going to become selfish and defensive. All right. Turns out, and here's the data that your audience needs to know. When we enter a group, we have innate involuntary needs that are activated. And if you don't check the box on those needs, people get selfish.
So can you give us an example of some of those?
Yes. The number one need we have that we're completely unaware of, most of us, is we have a need to belong. What does that mean? That means we want to be known, valued, and supported. So known and accepted is part of that. No, but I'm going to just put it on known, valued, and mutually supported. We'll be happy to support you if you support me. There's reciprocity in that. Okay. That is the number one need. And that's psychologists have agreed on this ages ago. But the psychologists in the US said, hey, by the way, you're not going to get that met. So walk into a team and assume you belong. Crap. You know what happens when you do that? You walk in and you're defensive from the start. Okay. So my argument is, coming back to the first cluster of norms, is you got to check that box. You got to make sure people are known. You'll see the number one norm in our model is understand your team members, get to know them. And coming back to the sports analogy or any of these analogies, you can come back to Star Wars, you can come back to Lord of the Rings. Those people know what each person's skills are, the value they add, and they can call on their skills when they need them. On the football pitch, I know how to kick the ball to you. I generally know where you're going to be standing. I know we know how to work together better. It's the same thing. By the way, Steve Jobs, when he invented the iPhone, he had a team coach that forced his team members to get to know one another, right? Coach's name was Bill Campbell, and his number one thing he did in teams was get people to know one another so that they could work together well. So coming back to the soft skills, I'm sorry, sounds soft, but if you want to be I never met an outstanding team where team members don't get to know one another. Here's the catch. They don't waste time while they're doing it, to do it. They build it right into the process, all right? So Bill Campbell, Steve Jobs' team coach, would start every meeting with what he would call trip reports. Where you been? What'd you learn? And everybody would go around the circle. Well, this is what I learned. This is what I noticed over here. And that peels the onion of who these people are, right? So it doesn't have to be a conversation where I'm like, hey, what do you like to eat? Eggs in the morning or oatmeal? It can be about what's making you nervous right now. What are we doing well? What are you excited about in our team? That's my favorite question. What's on your mind right now?
I mean, lots of people, because this is new to lots of people, and as you say, it's not taught. I mean, it's not something that we're given instruction around. So do we need to coach people to do this? So
Yes.
if Steve Jobs was bringing in a team coach to do it, then I suspect we all probably need to have some kind of coaching facilitation around.
Yeah, or you can read my book and you can learn a lot about what
Or
he
read
did.
your books. That's a
They'll
given.
always have coaches at the top of the organization, but if your audience is middle management, that's darn well that's the layer that doesn't get it well from the top.
No, it doesn't get the support. No,
They
exactly.
don't get the support, and that's why I wrote my book. I mean, I'll tell you one of the reasons why I finally wrote the book, because Harvard was asking me, because the Harvard Business Review article I'd written, they kept asking me to write it. I was asked to present to coaches. So big thing right now is leadership coaching. And many of these leadership coaches are finding that the biggest problems that leaders have is that they can't get their teams. So this coaching association brought me in to say, how do we coach these teams? So I went out and I looked at all the models that are out there. And I'm going to tell you, there's some great models out there. They just don't tell you. They just say, build trust, build commitment, build accountability, right? Guess what? You know what? If you build accountability, and I'll tell you, it's a great research done by Phil Tetlock at the Wharton School of Business. If you don't first build relationships and get to know each other before you build accountability, people will comply. They'll be accountable, but they're going to do lousy work. They don't do their best work. He says, hold the bastards accountable. I mean, I can't tell you how many meetings I'm in where the big CEOs, you hold your people accountable. Okay, well, I'm sorry. They will comply. But what do you want, especially in a team? What you want is them to be motivated to comply.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that discussion around trust, I mean, trust is an outcome. It's not something you can do. It's something that appears because other things have been done. And we spend a great deal of time talking about building trust, but you can't just do trust. You have to do all the other stuff. And the other stuff, it turns out, are these norms? Is that what you're saying? Is it
Yes.
understanding the team
So let me
members?
just tell you, so let's come back to the definition of a norm, which I haven't yet defined. I tend to forget that I need to give people these definitions. Norms are routines. It's how we do it here. So come back to how Bill Campbell started those meetings for Steve Jobs. They did a check-in at the start. They didn't waste a lot of time. Well, actually, they did long check-in because they had long meetings because they were a CEO level team. But I found you don't have to have a long check-in. You give everybody 30 seconds, right? But that's a norm. That's how we do it here. This is how we start our meetings. This is how we, in our team, here, let me give you an example because I always remember, I've been working, by the way, with remote teams. When you work with international teams, people are all over the place, right? The remote hybrid teams for years. And I remember interviewing this one leader who it turned out to be an outstanding leader. And I said to him, so what do you do about multitasking on those calls, when you have, Zoom calls, or back in those days, it was Skype or regular phone call. And he said, oh, we don't multitask on our calls. And, my husband and I at the time, shared an office, and he was working at IBM remotely. And he had 3 computers going and things. And I used to listen in on his calls, and everybody was multitasking during those calls. So I said to the guy, I said, how do you know they're not multitasking? And he said, because we agreed that we not multitask. That's how we do it here. So anyway, then I had the privilege of interviewing each of his team members, and I said to them, so do you multitask on those calls? They said, oh no, not in this team. I multitask on the other teams I'm on, but not. That's a norm. And they said, oh, it's great in this. We're so efficient in our meetings. Everybody's in, we all listen to each other. I just talked to somebody who told me about how they end their meetings with everybody would put their fist on the Zoom call and they'd touch each other. Yeah, that's the kind of esprit de when everybody's listening and everybody's in. And by the way, that's the second bucket of norms. Back to the first bucket is about caring for the individual, giving them feedback, figuring out how to work with them, and always respecting them. By the way, respect is like the air. And this is not my idea, it's somebody else's, I can't remember the name of the author, but when you have it, you don't even notice you've got it. When you don't have it, all you can
And you're gasping for it. Yeah.
yeah. So, for example, right now, Roddy, I feel respected by you. I hope you feel respected by me. If we weren't respecting each other, this would be a very different conversation. And, it's through nonverbals and it's not, but anyway, the second bucket of norms is about how you create that conversation where you're talking about what's working, what's not working. You're getting all voices in, you're being pessimistic. You're saying what could go wrong. Everybody's pitching in on that. You're being optimistic. Do we think we're going to do well? Yes, we're going to do well. You're creating all that stuff. Anyway, there's 4 norms that fit into that bucket. It's about how you work together the kinds of conversations that you have when you're working together and getting aligned. And the third bucket is about making sure you're reaching out to people outside for resources and new information so that you're not missing anything and so that you're constantly getting outlier information that can make you more clued into what's going on in the environment and better performing all around.
And that's important because otherwise you become very inward looking, and that's what the group think starts if you're not bringing in external viewpoints and awareness. But so what happens though when you have people displaying poor behavior within the team? How does one manage that? Because there are going to be people who don't comply with the norms, don't understand the norms, or just are disruptive.
Sure. So we work with it. There's a couple of norms, focus on that. First is a norm in the first bucket of norms, which is about how we help one another succeed. So one of the norms in there is called addressing unhelpful behavior.
Unacceptable behavior.
It's about behavior. So what we say is let's list what are the behaviors that we're going to call each other out on. What are the behaviors that are unacceptable here? And so you get permission, you come up with 4 or 5 things that you're going to call out. And so we'll talk about how you're going to call that out in a second, but you have to call it out, And by the way, back when we lived in tribes, so much of the way we work in groups, our social needs, for example, with belonging being the number 1, comes from when we lived in tribes and clans, for millions of years. They had very strict norms because they were life and death, In those days, if you get the game that you needed or get the food that you needed, and people weren't aligned around that. So they had very strict norms, and they would actually kick you out if you weren't following the norms. And as a part of that is why even today, we're worried about getting kicked out. One of the big
Yeah, sort of
contributors,
social ostracism, isn't it?
social
Yeah.
ostracism. Yeah, huge fear. It's universal. But anyway, so you have norms, and what we like to do is say, you got to give people feedback. You've got to say, hey, Roddy, we said we weren't gonna show up late, or we said we weren't gonna cut people off, or we said we were gonna listen carefully. Why aren't you doing that today? What's going on for you? And so you bring it up, and you make it a two-way conversations. And you get permission for that early on. I can say more about that if you want, because there's a ton more about it in my book, How You Do It Well.
Well, I'm conscious of time, that we could be here for days.
Yes, we could.
But I mean, is that the team leader's responsibility, or that's other people in the team's responsibility, or
Great
does it just
question.
depend on how people feel?
Great question. So when we build the norm, we do not want this all to be the team leader's responsibility. And so what I recommend that leaders do is they take a look at the current norms in the team. They say, what norms do we want? Okay, you're going to help me implement and help us adopt these norms. I want 2 people to be in charge of addressing unhelpful or counterproductive behavior, unacceptable behavior. Who's going to be in charge of that? Okay, Vanessa and Roddy, you 2 are in charge of that. Thank you. All right. So you have a lead and you have the support. And so what that means is that we're right now in the hot seat for calling out. How are we gonna? So we go back to the team and say, okay, here's how we're gonna call it out. Both Roddy and I used to play football when we were young, and we love the idea of yellow cards, red cards, but we're gonna add green cards. Actually, we're gonna throw away red cards because we don't want to kick anybody out. But if you do something like you show up late, or you interrupt, or you bring back shoddy work when you said you weren't, we're going to hold up a yellow card for you, or we're going to say yellow card for you. And it's really hard to do that. You have to practice it. But I'll tell you, when I work in Europe or I work in the UK, I actually haven't done any work in Scotland yet, but I have done a lot of work in the
Must
UK.
come. Must come.
Yeah, they love the yellow card, green card, or green card, Roddy, for doing that, coming back this time and giving us great work. And so you create ways for bringing people in. Let me say something's really, really key here. In the second bucket of norms, we have this thing where we say, let's assess the norms, what's working, what's not. And that's where we have an opportunity to say, hey, Vanessa and Roddy, will you cut it out with that yellow green card thing? It's really bugging me. Is there something else we could do? So you have an open conversation about how we're,
Yeah.
but
And that's what you said earlier, is about you've got a sort of generic model, but people need to adapt it so it
you need
works
to
for them.
adapt. You try something and then you adapt. Eventually, and I got to tell you, in one of Bill Campbell's great things that he did with coming back to Steve Jobs
Yeah.
norms and things, he called people out. One of my favorite quotes, I'm not going to say it because this is a bad word, but I've got it on my wall over here. He would say, yeah, that guy, he's one of the biggest horses of our time. And because he's not following the norms.
Well, and I love your reference there, tribal society, because
yes,
I've got, and we mentioned this in the discussion before we started, but I've got this emerging theory around the role of elders, or a modern day role for elders in
yes.
organizations, and by me elders, I don't mean old people. I mean
No, I know what you mean.
who
Yes.
have experience and have that collective desire to improve the organization rather than benefit themselves. So what gives them intrinsic value is the well-being of their organization, the tribe. And so they've got all these indigenous groups tend to have people who aren't the chiefs, they aren't the executives in the organization, but they've been there for a long time. They understand the norms, and they're sort of
Yes.
curators of the norms. They look after them, and they're the people who can step forward and perform exactly that role I think you've just said. I don't see that in a modern organization, and I think there's an opportunity in modern organizations for people in the middle
Absolutely.
to
Absolutely.
embrace that kind of responsibility.
So true. And today we don't help elders take on that role, and they need it, and they can do it. Back in the tribes, there's a great Harvard socioanthropologist named Joseph Henrich who studies these things. And one of the stories he tells is that, back in the tribal days, you had the young people who had the energy, but they didn't have the wisdom. When you were out hunting or you were doing anything, you needed that youthful energy, but you didn't have that wisdom. And that's collected over time. It's the same today. But so often now, especially in today's organizations where technology is king, we're not giving that level of respect to older folks. Ends up happening is older folks end up getting unhappy themselves. Anybody who's disrespected feels unhappy and is a time bomb.
Yeah, if you're ignored or overlooked, whatever it may be. And it's interesting. I mean, the Maasai, who I've spent a short
Oh,
amount of time,
right. Yes.
they
Say
have
more about that.
well, I mean, they had, and it's male only, so there are lots of flaws to it. It's not a
Of
perfect
course.
model by any means,
Yep.
but we're talking the young men when they're mid to late teens become warriors, and there's a painful, unattractive initiation that happens for them to do that, and then they go out, and in not that long ago, they go out and they'd hunt lions, and basically they came back if they hunted a lion, then that showed their manliness and their
Sure.
bravery.
Sure.
But that warrior tag, I think, fits very, very well for people who are going out and proving themselves
Yes.
in a modern day organization.
Yes.
But then you can't get married or start a family until you become an elder. And that shows that you've got some experience and a bit of
Fascinating.
wisdom. So you
Fascinating.
can become an elder in your mid to late 20s if you're sort of showing the right skills, in the same way as people become senior managers if they're sort of particularly adept at that kind of thing. So the parallels are there, but I think that people we see moving fast up the tree in an organization then want to get to the top of it. But there's still lots of people who can hold that wisdom, elderhood, and perform this really crucial role of oiling the wheels of teams and enabling the conditions that we require. And I think it's deeply human to do it.
Yes, absolutely. And let me just say this, though. What I see happening a lot in organizations is that these, if we want to call them the elders or the wise ones, they are not often given the respect. And so what ends up happening is they end up, reacting like anyone does when they're disrespected, which is they end up disrespecting the younger, rather than seeing their role. And it ends up being a negative spiral. So that creates more tension. And we have to get to know one another. We have to respect one another. The outliers, the bad behavior that you see, often is the most important thing that's going to help you change. You get your innovation from the people who are frustrated or who are engaging in these certain things.
The mavericks.
The mavericks. And sometimes that's the older folks who are saying, hey, that's when people say, hey, that's not how we do it around here. It could be because they feel completely disrespected in the group, right? And so you got to have more back and forth between them. And you got to think about when people are behaving that way, maybe that's time for a one-on-one coaching session, finding out what's really going on with that person. You want everyone in the team to feel like they've got a good voice and bringing something different to the team.
Fantastic. That's a perfect moment, perhaps, to draw a conclusion that, everyone has that role to bring stuff to the team and make it better performing and more fulfilling, because that's what we're seeking, isn't it? Vanessa Druskat, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Such a pleasure, Roddy. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. My pleasure.
Encouraging everyone to go and get their copy of The Emotionally Intelligent Team, available on Amazon and elsewhere. But no, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.